You think black families in the 1970s only had a few ways to stretch a meal through cold months? Think again. These resourceful kitchens turned modest ingredients into steaming pots of comfort that warmed bodies and souls alike. Here are 30 cheap winter stews no one makes anymore. Oxtail stew was once the crown jewel of winter cooking in black households, simmered low and slow until the meat fell away from the bone in tender ribbons. The oxtails were seared in a heavy pot until caramelized, then braised with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and root vegetables. Thyme, bay leaves, and allspice gave the broth a depth that filled the kitchen with warmth long before dinner was served. The marrow melted into the liquid, creating richness that no store-bought broth could match. Families gathered around for this dish on Sunday evenings, knowing one pot could feed everyone with enough left for Monday. The stew represented transformation, turning what butchers once discarded into something magnificent. Children learned early that the best flavor lived in the bones. Neck bone stew carried families through the coldest months when money was tight and bellies needed filling. Pork neck bones were cheap at the butcher counter, often sold for pennies a pound because most people overlooked them. But black cooks knew better. They understood these bony cuts held deep flavor, waiting to be coaxed out through gentle simmering. The bones were browned first, then covered with water and left to bubble alongside potatoes, carrots, onions, and celery until the meat became fork tender. Some families added turnips or cabbage to stretch things further. The smell alone announced dinner was ready, drifting through every room like a warm invitation. Children hovered near the stove, waiting to tear meat from bones with their fingers. This stew proved the humblest ingredients could become something worth gathering around. Ham hock and bean stew was a wintertime miracle that transformed dried beans and smoked pork into a meal substantial enough to fuel a family through freezing temperatures. The ham hocks were simmered for hours, their smoky essence infusing the cooking liquid while collagen broke down into silky richness. Navy beans or Great Northerns were added, absorbing every bit of porky flavor as they softened into creamy tenderness. Onions, garlic, and bay leaves rounded out the pot. This stew was Monday food in many households, made when the weekend ham bone still had meat clinging to it. The beans provided protein that rivaled expensive cuts, and the broth was considered medicine for cold and flu season. Families stretched this stew across several days, knowing each reheating only deepened the flavors. Chicken foot stew might raise eyebrows today, but in black kitchens of the 1970s, it was beloved comfort food made from parts others threw away. The feet were scrubbed clean, blanched to remove the outer skin, then simmered until they released natural gelatin into the broth. This created body and richness that regular chicken pieces could not achieve. Potatoes, carrots, and onions joined the pot, soaking up that deeply savory liquid. Some cooks added hot peppers for warmth that went beyond temperature. The stew was valued during winter illnesses when families believed its collagen-rich broth could heal what ailed you. Children sometimes balked at the appearance, but one taste usually converted them. The feet were free or nearly so, making this stew an act of pure kitchen wisdom, taking what was dismissed and creating nourishment. Pig feet stew was hearty winter fare that transformed an overlooked cut into something families craved when temperatures dropped. The feet were split, cleaned thoroughly, and simmered for hours until the skin became tender and natural gelatin thickened the broth into something luxurious. Onions, garlic, vinegar, and crushed red pepper created a tangy heat that cut through the richness. Some families added potatoes or beans to stretch the meal. The stew was made in large batches because it kept well and improved after sitting overnight in the refrigerator. The gelatin would set into a jiggly mass that liquefied again when reheated. This dish required patience. Rushing meant tough, chewy results. Children watched mothers and grandmothers tend these pots, learning that good food took time. Pig feet stew proved nothing went to waste. Turkey wing stew appeared on tables in winter, especially after holidays when turkey parts went on sale. The wings were large enough to provide substantial meat while remaining affordable for families watching every dollar. They were browned in a heavy pot until the skin crisped, then covered with water and simmered with onions, celery, carrots, and potatoes. The dark meat stayed moist through long cooking, becoming tender enough to fall from the bone. Bay, leaves, and thyme added depth without cost, and some cooks stirred in tomato paste for color. This stew fed families for days, the broth growing more flavorful with each reheating. Children loved pulling the meat from bones themselves, making dinner feel interactive. Turkey wing stew represented smart shopping and smarter cooking, turning sale items into meals that felt abundant. Beef tripe stew was not for the faint of heart, but those who grew up eating it remember the dish with deep affection. Tripe required thorough cleaning and long cooking to become tender, but the result was worth every minute of preparation. The honeycomb texture held onto flavorful broth, making each bite an experience. Black cooks prepared it with tomatoes, onions, garlic, and plenty of pepper, creating a stew with Caribbean and Southern influences intertwined. Some versions included potatoes or hominy to stretch the meal. The dish was considered special occasion food despite its humble origins, served when the family wanted something different. The smell was distinctive, earthy, and rich, announcing to the neighborhood that serious cooking was happening. Tripe stew taught children that texture and flavor mattered more than appearance. Smoked turkey, neck stew, became a healthier alternative to pork-based dishes while still delivering the deep, smoky flavor that Black families loved. Turkey necks were cheaper than most cuts and provided rich, dark meat that held up beautifully through hours of simmering. The smoking process had already infused them with flavor, so the stew needed little seasoning beyond onions, garlic, and bay leaves. Collard greens or cabbage were often added, cooking down in that smoky broth until silky and tender. Potatoes stretched the meal while absorbing all that savory liquid. This stew was considered lighter than its pork counterparts, but equally satisfying, perfect for families trying to eat better without abandoning. Comfort food. The broth was treasured almost as much as the meat, ladled over rice or sopped up with cornbread. Lima bean and ham stew was a thick, creamy bowl of comfort that stretched a small amount of meat into a meal for the whole family. Dried lima beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with chunks of leftover ham or a ham bone until everything melded into something greater than its parts. The beans broke down slightly during cooking, naturally thickening the broth into a consistency almost like gravy. Onions, garlic, and black pepper provided seasoning, while celery and carrots added sweetness and color. Some families mashed a portion of the beans against the pot to make things heartier. This stew was weeknight fare, simple to prepare but deeply satisfying when served over rice or with cornbread. The ham flavor permeated every bite, making even the plainest bean taste special. Black-eyed pea stew carried cultural significance beyond its role as winter fare. It was luck food, traditionally eaten on New Year's Day, but enjoyed through cold months. The peas were simmered with smoked meat, usually ham hocks or salt pork, until they became creamy and the broth turned rich with smoky depth. Onions, garlic, and tomatoes joined the pot, adding layers of flavor that made each spoonful interesting. Some cooks added collard greens directly to the stew, creating a complete meal that symbolized prosperity. The peas provided protein and fiber, while smoked meat added fat and flavor that satisfied deep hunger. Children ate this stew, knowing the stories behind it, that peas represented coins and greens represented paper money. This was tradition passed down through generations, connecting families to heritage through every bowl. Kidney bean stew was a thick, satisfying pot of comfort that required little more than dried beans, seasoning, and patience. The beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and whatever smoked meat the family had, often a ham bone or salt pork. The result was a rich, brick red stew that clung to rice and soaked into cornbread beautifully. Some cooks added bell peppers and celery, creating something close to simplified red beans and rice. This stew was Monday tradition in many households, made while laundry was done. Children came home from school to find it bubbling on the stove, its aroma promising warmth. The beans provided protein that stretched across several meals, and the broth was considered almost as valuable as the beans themselves. Chicken gizzard stew turned an often discarded organ into something families genuinely looked forward to eating. Gizzards were cheap at the butcher counter, sold by the pound for far less than other chicken parts. They required long cooking to become tender, but that time transformed their chewy texture into something almost silky. The gizzards were browned first, then simmered with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and potatoes until everything melded together. Some cooks added carrots or celery, while others kept it simple with salt, pepper, and bay leaves. The gravy that formed was dark and rich, perfect for ladling over rice or biscuits. Children who grew up eating this stew developed a taste for organ meats early. The dish represented kitchen wisdom, knowledge that parts others threw away could become dinner. Butterbean stew was creamy comfort in a bowl, made from large lima beans that broke down during cooking into something almost like a thick sauce. The beans were simmered with smoked ham hocks or bacon, their natural starch thickening the broth while pork added depth and richness. Onions and garlic were essential, as were bay leaves that perfumed the entire pot. Some families added tomatoes for color, while others preferred the pure, creamy simplicity of beans and pork. This stew was filling enough to serve as a complete meal, especially paired with cornbread that soaked up every drop of that silky broth. Children often requested seconds, not realizing how little the meal cost to prepare. Butterbean stew represented Southern cooking magic, transforming humble dried beans into something that tasted far richer. Pinto bean and sausage stew was hearty weeknight fare that stretched a small amount of meat into a meal substantial enough to feed a crowd. The beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with sliced smoked sausage, onions, garlic, and tomatoes until everything became tender. The sausage released its fat into the broth, creating richness that permeated every bite. Some cooks added chili powder or cumin for warmth, while others kept seasoning simple. This stew was often made on Sundays and reheated throughout the week, each serving tasting better than the last. The beans provided protein and fiber, while sausage satisfied cravings for meat without breaking the budget. Children grew up eating this stew over rice, learning that simple ingredients cooked with care could rival anything. Collard green stew was more substantial than the traditional pot of greens, with potatoes and meat added to create a complete meal in one pot. The greens were washed carefully to remove grit, then chopped and simmered with smoked turkey necks or ham hocks until tender. Potatoes were added partway through cooking, absorbing that smoky, slightly bitter broth until they became creamy and flavorful. Onions and garlic rounded out the pot, while vinegar or hot sauce added brightness at the table. This stew was winter medicine in many households, believed to ward off colds and provide strength during dark months. The potlikker was treasured, sipped from cups or soaked up with cornbread. Children learned to love greens through this stew, the potatoes and meat-making vegetables approachable. Beef shank stew transformed one of the toughest, cheapest cuts into something that rivaled expensive roasts in flavor and tenderness. The shanks were cross-cut to expose the marrow, then browned deeply before being covered with water or stock. Hours of gentle simmering broke down tough connective tissue into gelatin, creating a broth so rich it set solid when chilled. Onions, carrots, celery, and potatoes joined the pot, soaking up that beefy essence. The marrow was considered the prize, spread on bread or stirred into the stew for extra richness. This was Sunday dinner food, started in the morning and ready by evening. Families gathered, knowing the wait had been worth it, each bite tender and deeply satisfying. Beef shank stew proved patience could transform humble cuts into something special. Cabbage and smoked meat stew was economical brilliance, stretching a single ham hock or smoked neck bone into a meal that filled the whole family. The cabbage was chopped roughly and added to a pot where smoked meat had already been simmering, releasing its salty, smoky essence into the broth. Potatoes often joined partway through, adding substance and absorbing flavor. Onions, garlic, and black pepper were the only seasonings needed. The smoked meat did most of the work. This stew was cold weather food, made when temperatures dropped and appetites grew. The cabbage became silky and sweet, nothing like the raw vegetable that went into the pot. Children who claimed to dislike cabbage often asked for seconds. It represented simple cooking alchemy, transforming inexpensive vegetables into something families craved. Split pea and ham stew was thick enough to stand a spoon in, made from dried peas that dissolved during cooking into a creamy, satisfying base. The ham bone from Sunday dinner was the foundation, simmered until every bit of flavor had been extracted into the broth. Split peas were added and cooked until they fell apart completely, creating natural thickness without flour or cream. Carrots, celery, and onions provided sweetness and texture, while bay leaves and thyme added depth. This stew was often made midweek when the ham was gone, but the bone remained, proving nothing went to waste in a resourceful kitchen. The color was distinctive, army green, but the flavor was anything but bland. Children grew up eating this stew with crusty bread, learning that leftovers could become something entirely new. Beef heart stew was not for the squeamish, but those who grew up eating it remember the rich, almost beefy flavor that no other cut could match. The heart was trimmed of fat and tough valves, then cubed and browned before being covered with liquid and left to simmer. The meat was dense and lean, requiring long cooking to become tender, but the result was deeply satisfying. Onions, carrots, potatoes, and tomatoes stretched the stew while adding sweetness and color. Some cooks added Worcestershire sauce for depth, while others let the meat speak for itself. This stew appeared on tables when money was especially tight, organ meats costing far less than regular cuts. Children learned not to ask what was in the pot, just to eat what was served with gratitude. Navy bean and bacon stew was comfort food that required nothing more than pantry staples and a little time. The beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with thick-cut bacon, onions, and garlic until everything became tender and the broth turned cloudy with starch. Some families added tomatoes for color, while others preferred the pure white simplicity of beans and pork. Bay leaves and black pepper were the only seasonings needed. The bacon provided salt and smokiness that permeated every bite. This stew was often made in large batches because it kept well and reheated beautifully. Children came home from school to find it waiting on the stove, ready to warm them inside out. The beans provided protein that stuck to ribs, while bacon satisfied cravings for richness. Turnip and salt pork stew was humble cold weather fare that transformed root vegetables into something families craved when winter settled in. The turnips were peeled and cubed, then simmered with chunks of salt pork that had been rendered slowly to release their fat. The pork added saltiness and richness, while the turnips absorbed those flavors and became silky and sweet. Onions and black pepper were the only other seasonings needed. Some families added potatoes to stretch the meal further, while others kept it simple with just turnips and pork. This stew was often made when money was especially tight, turnips being one of the cheapest vegetables available. The broth that formed was thin but deeply flavored, perfect for soaking into cornbread. Children learned through this stew that even modest ingredients could taste like comfort. Chicken back stew was proof that nothing went to waste in a resourceful kitchen. The backs were often the cheapest parts at the butcher, mostly bone with bits of dark meat clinging to them, but they made some of the richest broth imaginable. The backs were browned first, then covered with water and simmered with onions, celery, carrots, and potatoes until the meat fell away and the broth turned golden. Some cooks added rice or noodles to stretch things further. The flavor was deeply chickeny, more intense than stews made from breast or thigh meat. Children grew up pulling small pieces of tender meat from the bones, learning that patience and attention could transform scraps into something satisfying. Chicken back stew represented the wisdom of generations who understood that flavor lived in the bones. Crowder pea stew was a southern specialty that showcased field peas at their creamy, earthy best. The peas were simmered with smoked ham hocks or salt pork until they broke down into a thick, almost gravy-like consistency. The cooking liquid became rich with smoky pork flavor, while the peas themselves turned soft and satisfying. Onions, garlic, and bay leaves added depth without overwhelming the peas' natural taste. Some families added tomatoes or hot peppers, while others preferred the pure simplicity of peas and pork. This stew was summer harvest food originally, made when peas were fresh and abundant, but it worked equally well with dried peas in winter. Served over rice with cornbread on the side, it was a complete meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like abundance. Ox tongue stew required commitment, but those who mastered it created something unforgettable. The tongue was first simmered for hours until the tough outer skin could be peeled away, revealing tender, beefy meat beneath. That meat was then cubed and returned to the pot with onions, carrots, potatoes, and tomatoes, simmered until everything melded into rich harmony. The texture was unlike any other cut, dense but somehow silky with a flavor more intensely beefy than regular roasts. This stew appeared on tables during hard times when tongue cost far less than conventional cuts. The preparation was labor-intensive, but the result fed families for days. Children who grew up eating it often didn't know what they were eating until years later. Ox tongue stew proved that adventurous cooking brought rewards. Chitterlings stew transformed pig intestines into something that divided families. You either loved it or couldn't stand the smell. The chitterlings required hours of cleaning before they could be cooked, a process that tested patience but rewarded dedication. Once cleaned, they were simmered with onions, garlic, vinegar, and hot peppers until tender and flavorful. Some cooks added potatoes or tomatoes to stretch the stew. The aroma was distinctive and powerful, announcing to the entire neighborhood what was cooking. For many families, chitterling stew was holiday food served at Christmas or New Year's alongside other traditional dishes. Children grew up with strong opinions about this stew, shaped by whether their families embraced or avoided it. The dish represented cultural continuity, a connection to ancestors who wasted nothing. Rabbit stew was country food that appeared on tables when someone in the family knew how to hunt or had connections to those who did. The meat was lean and mild, requiring gentle cooking to stay tender and the addition of fat to add richness. The rabbit was cut into pieces and browned, then simmered with onions, carrots, potatoes, and herbs until the meat fell from the bone. Some cooks added bacon or salt pork for extra flavor. The broth was lighter than beef stew, but deeply satisfying with a delicate gaminess that set it apart from chicken. This stew connected families to rural traditions even after they moved to cities. Children who grew up eating rabbit stew learned where food came from and developed appreciation for those who could provide it. Pigeon pea stew carried Caribbean influences into Black American kitchens, bringing tropical flavors to cold winter nights. The peas were simmered with coconut milk, smoked meat, and warm spices like thyme and allspice until everything became creamy and aromatic. Some versions included Scotch bonnet peppers for heat that built slowly and lingered. The peas held their shape better than other legumes, providing satisfying texture in every bite. This stew was often served over rice, the coconut-rich broth soaking into the grains beautifully. For families with Caribbean heritage, it was a taste of home and ancestors. Children learned through this stew that Black cooking traditions stretched across oceans. Pigeon pea stew represented the beautiful blending of cultures that defined so much of African American cuisine. Hogmaw stew was pig stomach, transformed into something surprisingly delicious through patient cooking and bold seasoning. The stomach was cleaned thoroughly, then stuffed with potatoes, sausage, and onions before being simmered until tender. Some families made it as a stew instead, cutting the stomach into strips and cooking it with vegetables. The texture was chewy but pleasant, similar to tripe but milder in flavor. This dish was Pennsylvania Dutch in origin, but spread through Black communities in the Mid-Atlantic. The stew was often made during the holidays when whole hogs were butchered and nothing was wasted. Children who grew up eating hogmaw stew learned not to judge food by appearance. The dish proved that unfamiliar ingredients could become beloved traditions with the right preparation.
Salt pork and cabbage soup was a meal built for hard weather and harder weeks, the kind that stretched calories when the fridge was nearly empty. Salt pork added just enough fat and flavor to turn cabbage and water into something that tasted like a real meal. Mothers chopped the cabbage, let it wilt in a pot with onions, then dropped in a small piece of salt pork that seasoned everything as it simmered. The broth turned savory and warm, filling the kitchen with a smell that made kids feel like dinner would be enough after all. Cabbage softened into silky ribbons that soaked up every bit of flavor, and no one ever complained about the simplicity because it tasted good and filled the stomach. It was cheap, reliable, and the kind of soup that made you forget for a moment how thin the grocery budget had become. Salt pork and cabbage soup tasted like winter resilience in a bowl.
Turnip green soup transformed Potlikker, the nutrient-rich cooking liquid, from simmered greens into a proper soup that children actually enjoyed. Black mothers knew that throwing away this flavorful liquid was wasteful, so they built entire meals around it. The greens were cooked with smoked pork until tender, then the liquor was enriched with additional vegetables, sometimes beans or rice. Children who might resist eating greens would happily drink this soup, absorbing vitamins and minerals without complaint. The smoky, slightly bitter flavor mellowed into something deeply savory that improved with each serving. This soup was medicine as much as meal, known to restore strength and fight off colds. Mothers understood turnip green soup represented wisdom passed through generations. What others discarded became nourishing treasure.
Cabbage and rice bake was an act of comfort disguised as frugality. Leftover rice met cabbage and beef in a casserole dish, topped with breadcrumbs or a drizzle of milk to keep it moist. It baked until tender, the top golden, the smell rich and homey. This dish was how families turned scarcity into satisfaction. It filled bellies without emptying wallets, and its leftovers reheated even better the next day. Many cooks flavored it with paprika, garlic, or tomato, each one adding their own touch of love. The rice made it stretch further, the cabbage made it wholesome, the beef made it feel complete. Served in deep scoops with bread and butter, it was more than a meal. It was reassurance that even hard times could taste good. In quiet kitchens across America, cabbage and rice bake became the taste of perseverance made edible. Winter greens and beans over rice was a complete meal built from the most dependable ingredients in a Black household pantry. Collards or turnip greens lasted through the cold, and dried beans stretched across days with hardly any cost. Mothers simmered the greens until they were tender, adding beans and seasoning to make the pot richer and more filling. The dish was poured over rice, transforming a handful of simple ingredients into something hearty enough to keep everyone full through the long winter evening. The flavors were deep, earthy, and comforting, the kind of warmth that stuck with you long after the bowl was empty. Kids ate it eagerly because it tasted good, but also because it felt steady and familiar. Winter greens and beans over rice were survival disguised as comfort.
Corn soup captured the essence of summer gardens in a bowl that children requested throughout the year. Black mothers cut fresh corn from the cob, scraping to extract every drop of milky liquid before simmering everything with onions, butter, and milk when available. The natural sweetness of corn needed little enhancement, though some mothers added a touch of sugar to deepen the flavor. During winter months, canned corn worked nearly as well, proving this soup's versatility across seasons. The soup was thick and creamy without being heavy, perfect for children who wanted comfort without feeling overstuffed. Some versions included bits of bacon for smokiness, while others stayed purely vegetable. This soup represented the connection between Black families and the gardens many tended. Every bowl tasted like sunshine and care.
Ground beef and oat loaf was the Depression's answer to meatloaf on a budget. When breadcrumbs were too dear, rolled oats stepped in, binding the meat and stretching it twice as far. Mixed with egg, onion, and a thin smear of tomato, it baked into a dense, hearty loaf that filled the kitchen with warmth. Each slice was firm and chewy, rich with the taste of hard work and determination. Served with mashed potatoes or a spoon of gravy, it gave families a sense of dignity. Real food, real effort, no waste. It was a meal of quiet pride, the kind that reminded people they could make do and still make something good. Even cold the next day, it tasted like comfort, its edges slightly sweet from the caramelized glaze. In every crumb was the story of making a little go a long way, and doing it with grace.
Split pea soup was a thick, hearty bowl of comfort that Black mothers made stretch for days on end. Dried split peas were simmered with ham bones or smoked turkey until they broke down into a creamy, satisfying soup that stuck to your ribs. Carrots, celery, and onions added sweetness and texture, while the smoky meat infused every spoonful with depth. The soup thickened as it cooled and became even better the next day when reheated with a splash of water. Children who might have turned their noses up at green foods found themselves asking for seconds. Mothers appreciated how affordable dried peas were and how far a single bag could stretch. This soup was especially welcome on cold days when something substantial was needed to warm the body. It was thrift and comfort combined.
Canned salmon croquettes were one of the most dependable winter meals because canned fish was affordable and easy to store. Mothers mixed the salmon with onions, egg, cornmeal, and seasoning, forming patties that hit the hot skillet with a satisfying sizzle. The croquettes browned beautifully, crisp on the outside and soft inside, carrying just enough fish flavor to feel special without costing much at all. Kids waited eagerly for them, especially when served with rice or bread on the side. The sound of the croquettes frying was almost as comforting as the smell, a steady reminder that dinner was close and that warmth would soon spread across the table. Sometimes mothers added leftover vegetables or herbs to stretch the mixture even further, turning one can into a feast that lasted the whole evening. It was a meal that tasted far richer than its price suggested, a reminder that skill mattered just as much as ingredients. Salmon croquettes were winter comfort mastered in a pan, a testament to cooking that found joy inside limitation.
Pig feet soup was the kind of old-fashioned cooking that Black mothers learned from their own mothers and grandmothers. The feet were cleaned meticulously and simmered for hours until the meat became tender and the natural gelatin created a rich, silky broth. Vegetables like onions, carrots, and potatoes joined the pot, absorbing the deep pork flavor. Children might have been hesitant at first, but the succulent meat and satisfying broth won converts quickly. This soup was considered both food and medicine, believed to help with everything from colds to joint pain. The collagen-rich broth gave it a body that other soups could not match. Mothers took pride in transforming these inexpensive cuts into something genuinely delicious. Pig feet soup connected families to traditions of waste-nothing cooking that stretched back generations.
Cabbage and noodles, Pulaski style, was comfort born in coal country. It came from immigrant kitchens where butter, onions, and cabbage were fried together until caramelized, then tossed with noodles and bits of ground beef. The result was smoky, soft, and faintly sweet, a dish that felt like warmth itself. It was cheap to make, easy to love, and could feed a crowd for pennies. In Pennsylvania, mining towns, and Midwest kitchens, Pulaski became more than a meal. It was memory on a plate. The sizzle of cabbage hitting butter, the smell of onions browning in old cast iron carried a rhythm of tradition. Even without meat, it was satisfying. With it, it became a small feast. Served in big enamel bowls, it spoke of perseverance, of families who worked hard, prayed often, and found joy wherever they could. Cabbage and smoked sausage skillet was the kind of dish that proved you could take almost nothing and turn it into something that fed a whole house without anyone feeling shortchanged. Cabbage was cheap, one of the cheapest vegetables in the store, and it filled a pot in a way almost nothing else could. Mothers would slice it thin, toss it into a skillet with a little oil, and stretch one single sausage link so far that every person at the table swore they got a piece. The smell of cabbage hitting the pan was unmistakable, sharp at first, but softening as it cooked down into something sweet and cozy. The sausage added just enough smoke to trick the mind into thinking the meal was richer than it really was. Kids would hover, waiting for the moment when the cabbage wilted just enough to match the shine of the sausage pieces. It was simple, hearty, and warm, and it filled bowls in a way that lasted through the night. In the winter, when money was tight and the weather felt unfriendly, this skillet kept people going. It tasted like thrift turned into comfort, like a mother's hands doing quiet miracles with whatever she had. It was everyday food that remembered its purpose well.
Butter bean soup carried a creamy richness that made children forget they were eating something simple. Black mothers simmered dry butter beans with ham hocks or bacon ends, letting the fat render into the broth, while beans softened into velvety perfection. Onions, garlic, and a bay leaf added depth, while cayenne brought gentle warmth to every spoonful. The beans broke down just enough to thicken the soup naturally. Mothers often mashed some against the pot's side to create that silky texture children loved. This soup was filling enough to serve as a complete meal, keeping growing children satisfied through long afternoons. It represented the quiet genius of Southern cooking, where patience and humble ingredients created something that tasted far more luxurious than its cost would suggest.
Cabbage and dumpling pot was a meal that filled both stomachs and hearts when little else could. It started with a pot of broth, sometimes made from beef bones, sometimes just salted water, and a heap of sliced cabbage simmering slowly until tender. Then came the dumplings, spoonfuls of soft flour dough dropped directly into the bubbling pot. They puffed up as they cooked, absorbing the savory flavor of the broth and the sweetness of the cabbage. The result was a meal thick and comforting enough to feed a family through the coldest night. It smelled like home and patience, like something that had taken time even when there was not much to spare. No one went hungry around that pot, and even the simplest ingredients tasted rich when shared with love. It was the kind of food that made silence at the table feel like gratitude. Neckbone stew was the kind of meal that held an entire household together when the cold crept in and the money ran out faster than anyone wanted to admit. Neck bones were cheap, sometimes only a few cents, but they carried enough flavor to build a whole pot of warmth around them. If you knew what you were doing, mothers and grandmothers would rinse them clean, drop them into a big pot of water, and let them simmer for hours until the kitchen filled with a slow, steady steam that made the windows fog up. Onions, celery, salt, pepper, and maybe a bay leaf. If the house had one left, all of it went in to stretch the bones into something that tasted rich and full. Even though the ingredients were simple, kids would hover near the stove, claiming they were cold, but really just waiting for that moment when the meat softened enough to fall from the bone with no effort. Rice or potatoes always went on the side because that was how you made a meal last. And nobody ever complained because the stew soaked into everything it touched. It was not fancy and it did not pretend to be, but it kept bellies warm during winters that felt too long and too hard. Neck bone stew tasted like survival, like patience, like the kind of care that did not need big speeches. It was a winter meal that carried whole families through nights when the house felt drafty and the bills piled high, and even today people remember it with a quiet kind of gratitude.
Neck bone soup transformed one of the cheapest cuts at the butcher into a deeply flavorful meal that children fought over. Black mothers browned the pork neck bones first, building a foundation of savory depth before adding water, vegetables, and seasonings. The bones simmered for hours, releasing collagen that gave the broth a silky body, while meat became fork tender. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and sometimes cabbage joined the pot, creating a complete meal in one dish. The aroma announced to the neighborhood that something special was cooking. Children learned to pick every bit of tender meat while savoring the rich broth that clung to each piece. This soup proved that skilled hands could transform the humblest ingredients into something children would remember forever. Potato soup was the rescue meal Black mothers made when there seemed to be nothing else in the house.
Cabbage and tomato skillet was what you made when there was nothing left to make. Ground beef, shredded cabbage, canned tomatoes, and onion, fried together until the house smelled like survival. It was not elegant, but it was honest. Every spoonful delivered the bite of pepper and the sweetness of cooked-down cabbage, proof that even a few cheap ingredients could become a family's dinner. This was the food of mill towns, tenant farms, and one-room apartments where every penny mattered. It cooked fast, served plenty, and left almost nothing to clean up. A working mother's blessing. The color alone was cheerful, red and green against the gray of winter. And though no one wrote down the recipe, everyone remembered it. The cabbage and tomato skillet was not about perfection, it was about endurance, the kind that fed both hunger and hope.
Which forgotten stew would you bring back to your table? Drop it in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more flavors from the past.